Welcome to this episode of the Suitcase Sessions. I'm your host, Bob Bowman, and today I want to share some engaging information about the cigar box itself. We'll talk about what they're made of, how taxes played a role in the size of the box, and we'll share a few interesting facts that perhaps you didn't know. So for the next few minutes, let's find a place in the shade, set down our suitcase and cigar box guitar, and enjoy the show. I probably own most of the books on the market that talk about cigar box guitars, but only a few focus on the historical background of the cigar box itself for more than a few paragraphs. There is, however, a book that breaks down everything you ever wanted to know about cigar boxes, and its author is who I derive much of my information from. Whenever I want to do anything from dating a box to determining the size of the factory that distributed its contents. That author is Tony Hyman, and he made it his life's passion to know everything about them. So, based on information obtained in both Tony Hyman's definitive book on cigar boxes and his curated online cigar history museum, we learn that cigar boxes can be broken down into basically two categories: wood and everything else. While most of the early boxes were made from various hardwoods, at least they were through about 1920 when cost-cutting measures were introduced and cheaper grades of wood covered in paper or cardboard were used. The best or most ideal wood for packing those cigars in was Spanish cedar. Spanish cedar not only looks nice in its uniformity and grain, but it also repels insects. And while both of those qualities are interesting, perhaps the most important quality is found in its ability to maintain a fairly consistent humidity level inside the box while the lid is closed. In an article I read in a copy of the Cigar Aficionado magazine's Summer of 1994 edition, Tony provided some interesting context for how our boxes came to be sized and marked. In that article, he shared that President Abraham Lincoln was desperate to raise wartime revenue, and he imposed taxes on a long list of 19th century luxuries that included soap, perfume, playing cards, photographs, bank checks, and even patent medicine. In 1863, he also called for a tax on alcohol and tobacco. But it's one thing to impose a tax, it's quite another to collect it. In two previous wars, the government tried to tax alcohol and tobacco, but failed in the face of widespread evasion. After that, the government finally took its tax collection seriously, closing loophole after loophole, making evasion ever more difficult. It was the first in a series of efforts that would make alcohol and tobacco the most regulated products in America. A series of oppressive laws which controlled the entire manufacturing process monitored leaf tobacco so tightly that cigar makers were required to file government forms before carrying leaf from one room to another. Prior to the Civil War, few cigars were packed in boxes. Even in Cuba, most cigars were sold singly, by the handful, or in small wrapped bundles called yagues, made from palm leaves. In this country, cigars were typically shipped in barrels of 2,500 or more. Overworked revenue agents faced with counting individual cigars in a factory found it impossible to keep track of the movement of taxed and untaxed cigars, and as one harried agent complained to Congress, they all look alike. The Revenue Act of 1864 tried to solve the problem by requiring that all cigars needed to be packed in boxes or bundles. But as Tony worded it, feisty cigar makers harassed inspectors with odd lots, turning record-keeping into a nightmare. With Lincoln's strong support, the laws of 1865 resolved the problem of counting by requiring that all cigars, foreign or domestic, be packed in wooden boxes containing 25, 50, 100, or 250 cigars. In doing so, gave the IRS agents somewhere to paste a stamp, proving taxes on them had been paid. By the end of the war, cigar boxes were everywhere, and the federal solution to a very taxing problem had been solved. In a December 2015 article published in FamousSmoke.com's Cigar Advisor, entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Cigar Boxes, written by John Pullo, provided us with 2 interesting facts that I thought would close this episode with. First, we've probably all seen cigar box guitars made from Upmann boxes. They're solid and sturdy, and they make for a great body to start from. As it happens, the Upman brothers were reported to be the first to package their cigars in a box. Though they didn't have the Upman name stamped on the boxes in the early stages, since they hadn't branded yet under that name. As John Pullo points out, the Upmans were a family of German bankers, and sometime around 1840, Herman and August convinced their father that it would be a grand idea to open a bank branch in Cuba. Herman, it seemed, doubly benefited from the deal. Not only was the bank a success from the start, but he also happened to be quite the cigar enthusiast. His relocation to Havana was a no-brainer. Shortly after, Herman began sending cigars from various Cuban factories back home to Europe. They'd be packaged in cedar boxes, stamped with the bank's name, and given as gifts to his most influential clients, as well as for marketing purposes. In just a few short years, Upman was immersed in cigar exporting, and by 1844 he had invested in a factory to produce his namesake H. Upman cigars. The bank would go on to fail by the 1920s, and the cigar venture did too, until it was purchased from bankruptcy by the Garcia Menendez Yacía Company in 1937. And finally, he stated something we already know. Cigar boxes make dang good instruments. Once the cigar box was a requirement for taxation, John states that the question arose about what to do with them once they were empty. He credits our forefathers for upcycling cigarbage as early as the Civil War. Of note here, the earliest known illustration of a cigar box instrument is an etching by Edwin Forbes, copyrighted in 1876, of two Civil War soldiers at a campsite, one of whom is playing a cigar box fiddle. Soldiers were making fiddles out of them to pass the time in camp between marches and battles. He continues by pointing out that long after the South was ravaged by deep poverty lasting long after the Great Depression, these so-called primitive instruments, like the cigar box guitar or CBG, became essential to the development of the blues movement. Essentially, artists had the skills to make the music, but they didn't have the money to buy the real instruments. So, they made their own with items they could find. Considering how cheap cigars were at the time and how many were being produced, empty boxes were plentiful. And to illustrate just how prevalent cigar boxes were and still are, and this point contributes to every cigar box guitar builder's addiction, did you know that between 1800 and 1960, a full 80% of all cigar boxes were made of wood? And a reasonable estimate puts the number of boxes made and put into circulation at approximately 8 billion. And for the record, another 2 billion boxes covered all the other types made from materials you may not have thought of aside from those economical cardboard, like aluminum, brass, ceramics, glass, pewter, plastic, porcelain china, silver plate, tin foil, and those traditional palm leaves I previously mentioned. By the way, the list of artists who started their careers on homemade instruments made from cigar boxes or that incorporate them into their performances today is extensive. It will be the subject of a future episode. Well, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Suitcase Sessions. Join me next time as I interview Mike Breedlove of MGB Guitar Parts and Supplies in Tampa, Florida. Mike is a multifaceted man with a rich history and diverse interests. I'm sure you'll find the episode both engaging and informative. So if you're enjoying the show, why not hit the subscribe button and follow us each week as we continue to explore the world of cigar box guitars. Until then, remember, there are no rules. Just keep playing, and we'll catch up later, somewhere down the road.